So each and every season going into week 12 and week 13, I always have a list of things that I want to test so I can try to figure out ways of improving setups or speed or even driving techniques, different types of things. And this season, going into this week 12 and upcoming week 13, one of the things that I wanted to test had to do with the NASCAR Xfinity series. Now, with the Xfinity series cars, I've always had really good success in a kind of a certain box in terms of how I build my setups, whether it be, no more than 400-pound springs in the front, or always using stiffer springs in the rear, especially on the bigger mile to 2 mile tracks. Well, one of the things that I wanted to test was the coil bind setups on the mile to 2 mile tracks. And when one of my buddies here in the SSR community actually told me that, hey, doing these coil bind setups can drastically improve your speed, I jumped on the opportunity that I had this week to do some testing, and I gotta tell you, the results were pretty freaking incredible. So in this video, I'm going to actually show you the difference between a coil bind setup and a traditional setup on the Xfinity cars at a 1.5 mile track, so you can see how much better it can be, and also the cons that go with it, so you can determine whether or not you want to actually use it. What's up, everybody? Thomas Brandon here. Thank you very much, as always, for joining me. And like I said, we're going to be taking a look at a traditional setup versus a coil bind setup. We're going to be using Chicagoland because that is the race on the schedule next week. But keep in mind, this type of setup comparison will work for basically a 1 mile track or bigger. But you do have to use a 350-pound right spring or softer. There are some parameters that go with this that you got to follow, and I'll kind of cover that here in the video. Now, one thing that you need to know is that if you are a setup builder, okay, if you build setups and you have not played with this coil binding stuff yet and you want to start doing it now, there is a huge difference between building the coil bind setup and what you might be used to with the traditional setups. You're going to find that these setups they just feel different. They obviously handle different. There's some big reasons for that, which we're going to go over. I'm going to show you guys kind of the differences, what to expect, what is the pros with the coil bind setup, what's the cons with it, because believe it or not, it's not just all sunshine and rainbows. There is some downside to it. So we're going to cover that, and I'm going to show you some comparisons, not only in terms of lap times, but also overall runs, kind of longer runs, how they do with the tires, how they did with the speed, and stuff like that. So let's head over and let's take a look. All right, you guys, so really quick now, do me a favor, if you like this video while I'm showing you this stuff, please hit that like button and subscribe, and then also share this. All right, like share this with whether it's your teams, your friends, your groups, whatever, right, your discourse or whatever it is, because like I said, it was a pretty big breakthrough for me. I was actually really shocked at what I found and the results that I saw. And so, it was one of those things that it was just really an aha moment for me, because I had never really messed with it before. I shouldn't say never really. I've never messed with it. I just haven't. The only time I've ever even driven a coil bind setup was in a fixed race. It was in an iRacing fixed race, and it was a while ago. Okay, I think it was on like the previous version of the tire. I mean, it was like 2020. I mean, it was a long time ago. So I have not driven them or messed with them. Okay, so it was a really big thing, to kind of figure this out. Now, a couple of things to note. If we take a look here at the traditional style setup, okay, a traditional setup that we've got, all right, it's going to be something that looks like this. You've got your front springs, right, that are whatever your front spring package is. You can run whatever it is. But on the rears, you're usually going to be running something like this. I usually run, as you guys know, in the Xfinity setup videos that I've done before, I usually run a stiffer left rear spring, usually somewhere between like 600 to 800 pounds. I do that because of the dynamic cross weight that I can get out of the car. So it allows me to get an inverted crossweight curve through the corner, meaning that there's higher cross weight going into the corner, which allows the car to go in straighter, and then that cross weight decreases at the apex of the corner, which allows it to roll the middle much better, and then it increases as we accelerate out of the corner, which once again allows it to come out straight. Okay, so that's kind of what I'm looking for when I'm building a setup, and that stiffer left rear spring allows me to do that. So I would typically find a left rear spring that would feel good, and then I would start kind of building the setup around it. Okay, like that's pretty much what I would do. And a lot of times at tracks like this, Chicagoland, Vegas, Kansas, right, Atlanta, right, pick your mile and a half. I'm going to have a stiffer right rear spring, not always, but for the most part. And then I'm going to be running some track bar rake and stuff like that and get my cross weight set to balance out the tire wear. And, you know, bada bing, bada boom, right? There's my setup. With the coil binding setup, however, very, very different. And the reason that it's very, very different is the restrictions that you have on the springs. Now keep in mind, the biggest draw with the coil binding setup, okay, is going to be this right here, where it says that tuning with this configuration can allow the use of a very soft right rear spring to keep the car low to the racetrack on the straights, but out of the ground in the corners. Okay, now this is only available with spring rates 350 pounds or less, and it's got to be at tracks larger than a mile. So you can't do this at like Bristol, okay, or Iowa or Martinsville, right? It's only going to be at those tracks that are bigger than a mile. And to be honest with you, you don't really want to do it at a track smaller than a mile, because of the fact that the difference in handling and downforce was pretty incredible. We're going to actually take a look at the data, but it was pretty incredible. Now, keep in mind, if we look here at examples of rake angles on an F1 car, and I know F1 cars are different than NASCARs, but just keep in mind we're talking about the rake. If you look at a comparison between the Red Bull and the Mercedes, right? And this is an older picture. This is from like 2015, 2016, but for the most part, this kind of stayed true all the way through last year. The Red Bull cars always had the most rake angle, okay? But you can see a difference of only 0.7 degrees, and that equaled a huge difference in terms of downforce. It's been known that, for those of you who follow Formula One, you can attest to this. The Red Bull cars have always been described as the high downforce, you know, better handling in terms of twisty, tight corners and stuff like that, where the Mercedes were always known for kind of the high speed straightaways and stuff like that. And rake angle has a huge effect on that, okay? It's a big reason for that. It's the same thing with these cars, okay? It's the same thing with these cars, the trucks, any type of car that you are generating downforce. Your rake angle is going to have a lot to do with that. So when you do a coil binding setup, okay, understand you are giving up downforce. Absolutely, 100% you are giving up downforce. But here's the deal, you're also decreasing drag. And when you decrease drag, you increase speed. So there is a trade-off to it. And this is the thing that you need to understand. With the more traditional setup, the car is going to have much more stability and have much more traction, specifically on the rear, because of the increased rake angle. When we look at the data, okay, if we judge just the rake angle of the cars and what that equates to in downforce based on how I measure downforce, all right, we go through this every time I bust out Motec, but if you look at just the rake angle, you're talking about almost 0.3 degrees, okay? Doesn't seem like much, but in the way that I measure downforce, it is a deduction of 250 pounds of force in terms of downforce on the car, okay? Once again, might not sound like a lot, but that is, and you can absolutely feel it in terms of the car and how it feels on the track. You really can. And another thing that you need to understand is that these coil binding setups, because the rear springs are so soft, and because you are coil binding them, they are way more loose than a traditional setup. Now you might be wondering, well, Tommy, how can that be with the super soft rear springs? Well, here's the deal. When you coil bind a spring, the spring rate for that spring goes from, let's just say here we have a 225 pound right rear spring. When that thing is coil bound, it goes from 225 in terms of the rate to like 5,000. It still has a spring rate in terms of the force and the pressure. It's just not sprung anymore, right? It's coil bound. So that spring rate increases an enormous amount, which can make the car really, really loose. Because keep in mind, you don't want to have the right rear coil bound and then have to run an 800-pound left rear spring, right, to make the car handle better. That completely defeats the purpose of coil binding the rear. So you've got to run a soft left rear spring as well to really get that rear end to squat and get the car to work the way that you want it to work. And so this causes a huge change in all of the stuff on your setup. You're going to be running much different cross weights. You're going to be running different track bars. Everything's going to be basically different. Okay. Really about the only thing that was similar was the shocks. About everything else was pretty much different. All right. So that's something that you need to understand going into this. If you are someone like me who was very used to traditional setups and you kind of got those down or figured out, I should say, going to this, it's a new experience. Okay. Now, when we actually look at the differences here, what kind of improvements did we see? So first of all, if we look at just pure short run speed, all right, I went out and I basically just ran like 7 laps. Okay, if you look at the traditional setup versus the coil bind setup, and this is running the same lines. Okay, so I do what I always do, where I run a couple laps around the bottom, a couple around the middle, and then a couple around the top. Okay, if you can look here at the differences, you can see that our average lap time was a 1/10 of a second faster, 0.121 faster. All right. Now you think about that over the course of 7 laps, right there, you are 7/10 of a second faster than the previous setup. Now keep in mind, this is something that I want you guys to understand. Okay. This coil bind setup, like I said, feels very different. Okay, it really did feel, I almost have to drive the car differently. All right, now that could be because of the setup and the track. All right, like keep in mind, I've only tested this at a couple tracks. I have not done this at all the tracks yet. So obviously different tracks are going to have different results. But in terms of what I've seen so far, all right, just pure acceleration, speed, stuff like that, it was faster, just flat out faster. 1/10 of a second per lap is huge. That's a huge gain. When we look at the fastest lap, once again, it was 0.12 seconds faster, so more than 1/10 faster. And our slowest lap was still a couple hundredths faster. Really, really nice improvement. All right, really nice improvement. Now, when we look at this in terms of kind of the data, right? So what's really going on here? Why is this so much faster? Well, this is largely so much faster because of the fact that you are getting that spoiler out of the air. You're running much less rake angle. And when you run less rake angle, that allows you to actually get the front of the car lower. I know that kind of sounds counterintuitive, but you can, because if you think about the car as like a balance beam, right? If you have more rake like this, what's going to happen? The nose is lower. But if you level it out, now the nose is higher, which means you can run smaller packers and it'll get that car, the whole car, much, much lower. And we were able to get the entire car. If we look at the ride heights here, you can see that the coil bind setup, which is the colored lines, and the traditional setup, the white lines, we are a full inch lower on the rear. That's huge. I mean, really think about that, you guys. A full inch. I mean, that's insane, right? That's a huge amount. On the front of the car, we were about 1/2 to 3/4 of an inch lower. And keep in mind, that's just on average. When you start looking at it through the corners and on the straights and stuff like that, it's even bigger fluctuations. That's just the average. Huge difference in terms of how much lower you can get the car because of this coil bind setup. And keep in mind, on the coil bind setup, I'm actually running stiffer front springs than on the traditional setup, and I'm still getting it that much lower. Okay, so it's all about the angle of the car and what you're doing with it. And I run my cars basically at minimum ride heights. Okay, it's not like I've got the front at 5 inches and the rear at 8 inches. No, I'm running my fronts at kind of the lowest amount that I can get them to, and I'm running my rears at like the lowest amount. It's always 7.0 and the front is always 4.5 on both setups. So huge difference in terms of the dynamic ride heights of the car. And that equates a much faster lap time. Okay, it's got much more speed. Now, once again, like I said, it's not all good. There are some downsides. The biggest downside is the stability of the car. The car is much, much looser. Now, you can tighten it up mechanically. Okay, you can do adjustments and tighten it up mechanically, but when I was building this setup, the one thing that I realized is that if I tightened it up too much on the short run, what would happen is by the time we got towards the longer run, like 15-20 laps into the run, I'd already smoked my tires, even if I wasn't pushing it. Okay, so it was one of those things where I had to actually start it off, and it starts off even more loose than my traditional setups, and kind of wait for it to come in. Now, over the course of the long run, it still performed phenomenal. Keep in mind, I did a 20 lap run. Okay, I didn't go out and do a full long run, and the reason for that has to do with the way that you drive the car. All right, how hard you push it in the beginning, all of those things are going to have an effect on the long run. Okay, a full fuel run. So what I did was a 20 lap run, and you can see here on the 20 lap run, it was very, very similar to what we saw on the short run, right? With the short run where I'm pushing it really hard. Here, not pushing it as hard. I ran the 20 laps the way that I would if I was in a race. Okay, and you can see here the differences once again are very similar to what we saw on the short run. Our average lap time was 0.2 of a second faster with the coil bind setup. Our fastest lap times were almost the same, only a difference of 700ths. And then our slowest lap time was a tenth of a second faster, almost a tenth and a half. Okay, now that's really, really important, because when we think about the fall off on a setup, that matters a lot. Keep in mind, like I said just a second ago, how hard you push it, your driving style, all of those things are a factor when it comes to your tire wear and how the car is going to do over 50 or 60 laps. Okay, but I just wanted to do this to kind of see if there was a big trade-off, right? If the car's this much faster, are we losing it on the back end? And what I can tell you right now from all the testing I've done is no, because keep in mind, these setups that I just showed you, these are insider setups. This is what I'm giving to the insiders in the SSR Insider program, which means that I've done full long runs on these setups. I've done complete fuel runs, and I know the tire wear is good. I know the car is good throughout the entire run, so I wouldn't be giving them that if they were crap. Okay, so I know that they're good. All right, now when we look at the tire wear, right, like what were the tires like after those runs? When we look at the traditional setup, you can see that our left side tires are about where you would typically see them, right? Mid 90s. And then our right side tires, we've got low 80s on the right front, and then low 80s on the right rear. Okay, so we've got 81, 80, 83, and then on the right rear, 82, 81, 84. All right, so pretty good. That's about what I would expect to see on one of my setups. Okay, when we look at the coil bind setup, it's actually a little bit better. It's not a ton, but it is a little bit better, right? Where we've actually got 80 through 80, 83, 82, 86, and then 83, 83, 86. So the tire wear is actually a little bit better. Now keep in mind, this was only 20 laps, but a 20 lap run, when you see a difference of a couple percentage points, does add up when we look at it based on a 40, 50, or 60 lap run, right? I think at Chicagoland, a full fuel run is about 55 laps, 56 laps. So you can see probably almost double in terms of the tire wear. Now keep in mind, that's maintaining the same pace. That's also me by myself. Traffic is going to make a huge difference in terms of how the car feels and how you're going to drive it and whatnot. But by myself in the testing that I've done, and I'll keep in mind, I did do AI testing too. I did run this against AI cars. Everything felt really, really good, and the car overall performed really, really well. So when it comes to the coil bind setup, like I said, there's pros and cons. In terms of the pros, obviously the lap time for me was definitely quicker. The overall speed was much quicker. In fact, I saw about a 2 mile per hour increase in terms of straightaway speed. All right, so on the high end, at the end of the straightaway, fastest lap to fastest lap, the coil bind setup was about 190 miles per hour, where the traditional setup was about 188 miles per hour. Keep in mind, driving style, what line you run, that's all going to have an effect. But this was an apples to apples comparison where I ran the top line in the traditional setup, and then the top line in the coil binding setup, and that was the difference. Also, in terms of average speed, there was about a mile per hour increase in terms of the overall average speed. So that means that we're maintaining an average speed about a 1 mile per hour faster in the coil bind setup than the traditional setup. Once again, handling, driving style, all of those are going to have an effect. Okay, so that does not mean that if you run a coil binding setup, expect to see just massive increase in terms of your speed and improvement in your lap times. Okay, because like I said, it was definitely a different feeling car. Okay, losing that downforce, huge difference in terms of what we typically ran with the traditional springs. All right, so just keep that in mind. All right, but like I said, in terms of pros, definitely saw faster lap times, definitely saw quicker overall speeds. Car actually felt better to me over the long run. I really like a loose race car. This car was much more loose, which allowed me to really, save my tires over the long run. One thing to note though is that when the car is that loose, if you don't take care of not just the right front but the right rear, it can get really loose towards the end of the run. It can get really loose. So that's something that you definitely want to keep in mind. Now, cons are, one, it's a much more loose race car. Yes, you can fix it in terms of adjustments, but you're going to really destroy your right front tire if you don't set the thing up correctly. Okay, you've got to make sure that you've got a balance because of that change in lack of rear downforce. It's going to feel way more loose, and if you try to just tighten that thing up mechanically, you can really upset the balance of the car, which can have a really bad effect over the long run. You're also losing a lot of downforce, like we just talked about. That is also a con. Keep in mind, downforce provides stability. All right, and that can have a huge effect, especially when you start talking about racing around other cars. One thing that I noticed when I did the AI race was I really liked the way that the coil bind setup felt in dirty air. It did not seem to affect me as much because the car was not air dependent as it was, right? So because we're not using as much downforce or generating as much downforce, when I got behind another car, it didn't seem to affect me nearly as much as it did with the traditional setup. Now that's just me, and like I said, I've only done a few tests, so don't just take that as gospel. All right, there might be instances where it feels really bad. So those are things to think about. Like I said, it's not just all positives. There are some downsides or potential downsides depending on how you like the car to feel and your driving style. And that's the most important thing. All right, no matter what kind of setup you run, it does not matter. You can go out and you can get the setup from the Keegan Leahy, right? Just the Coke Series champion, or Ray Alfala, or Michael Conti, or pick your pro. It does not matter. You can get their exact same setup, and you could be way slower and not even get around the track, right? Be wrecking into the wall because your car needs to be built to you. If you are not comfortable, I don't care what the setup is, you're not going to be fast. So making sure that you're comfortable is always going to be the number one priority. Now, if you can run this setup and be comfortable, then you might be able to see results like I saw, which once again, like I said, were pretty surprising and ultimately incredible, which I was really happy about. All right, you guys, so that's going to do it all for this video. Now, like I asked earlier, or like I said earlier, if you like this, please hit that like button. Also, make sure to subscribe and share. It really helps out, grows the channel, does all that stuff. Everything that you hear every other YouTuber on earth talk about, all right? It does all that stuff. So if you want to help out this YouTube channel or support the community, that's the best and easiest way to do it, is just hit the subscribe button, like the video, share, and then also comment down below if you think that this is a good thing. If you actually like these setups, if you've ran this setup before and you like it, leave a comment down below. All right, so that way people out there who watch this kind of know that, hey, other people have done this and it's not, something that's that bad, or it's not bad, it's a good thing, right? Other people have ran it and had some success. Okay, and if you've ran this and you didn't like it, also leave that down below. So like I said, that way people kind of know. We don't just want everyone to see this and be like, oh, well, Tommy had awesome success with it, so it must be great, right? We don't want to do that. There's a reason why I gave the insiders 2 setups for this next week. Okay, I gave them a traditional and a coil bind setup because, like I said before, it's not going to fit everybody's driving style. There's going to be people who just don't like it. Okay, so if you've used this before at any of the tracks that you can use that and you like it or don't like it, please comment down below and give us the reasons why, so that way more people can see and hopefully learn. Also, if you want to actually check out the SSR website, the free membership site, we do have a bunch of free setups coming for the asphalt side. We've already got all the dirt stuff covered with free setups and stuff like that, but I'm got a new builder coming on to the insider program for the short track oval stuff, where they're going to be taking care of the late model, super late model, SK mod, and tour mod, and they're also going to be adding the legends. We've never had legends before, but because he knows how to build them, we're going to be adding those to the insider program as well. And so because of that, it's going to give me a lot more free time to where I can build more free setups for people and get those on the membership site, the free membership site. So if you want to get that, also I do have new paint jobs coming for the asphalt stuff. We've got, you know, free paints for the dirt and stuff like that, but I've got free paints that we're going to be doing. They're nothing special, but they're just nice, clean, simple paint jobs that you can grab and run if you need something and you want something, like I said, for free, right? So if you want to check that out, plus we've got suits and helmets and setup guides, and we've got the asphalt masterclass, all kinds of stuff on there, and it's all for free. If you want to check any of that stuff out, head over to schoolofsimracing.net, or you can click on the link down below in the description, and that will take you over to it, and that gives you access to our Facebook group, our Discord, all of that stuff. And like I said, we've got a bunch of really cool stuff coming, so if you want to check out any of that stuff, check out the links down in the description below. Finally, if you want to join our winner circle here on the YouTube channel, check that out as well. It gives you access to early access to these videos when I get them up and out on time. You know, hopefully that will be improving a lot more too, with the free time, the increased free time that I'm going to have. And then it also gives you access to the live stream recordings that we do, and you know, some emotes and some other stuff like that as well. So if you want to check that out, that's down there as well. And then finally, because I know I'm going to have a lot of people asking me about this, I'm going to be doing a live setup workshop probably tomorrow. Yeah, I'll be doing it tomorrow. So instead of a Fast Friday video tomorrow, I'm going to be doing a live setup workshop for the Xfinity, where I'm going to actually show you how to build a coil binding setup for this car. All right, we're going to do it at a different track besides Chicagoland, because I've already built one for Chicagoland, but we're going to be doing it at another track. I think we've got Nashville Super Speedway coming up in a week or two, and so we'll probably do it for there. And I'm going to show you guys how to build these things, because it is a different process than the other ones. Okay, it is a different process. So I'm going to show you how to actually build a coil binding setup. We're going to be doing that tomorrow. So if you want to check that out, right, and you want to make sure that you catch that live, make sure you subscribe, all right, so you can get notified when we get that thing going, because it'll probably kick off around either noon to 1 p.m. Eastern, somewhere right around there. Okay, but you guys, that's going to do it. Thank you very much, as always, for joining me. I really appreciate it. And until next time, I want to wish you good luck, good racing. Take care.